But in general, and especially among young people, this was a central question basically for 3 years, which also began earlier in the fight for the Algerian woman who fought for freedom in Algeria, Jamila, I forget her name, and for Manolis Glazos in Greece, and for the for the Vietnamese people, and for the South Africans. A terrific, solid, and most dramatically for Allende. When Allende was thrown out and killed, there was an outpouring in the main street of East Berlin, Unter den Linden, which was absolutely spontaneous, unlike most demonstrations. Thousands and thousands came there to mourn and protest because Allende was a hero to millions there. And when he was overthrown, it was very bitter. So this idea of solidarity was, without saying that it was 100%, but very, very important in the GDR.
Okay, so one more question is the follow-up question, but before that, I have two questions for you.
Go ahead.
One is personal, if you will accept it, and if you say don't, then it's fine.
No, any personal questions, I'm glad to answer.
So the second one is a political.
What was the first one?
First one, okay. I'll give you. How did socialism help resolve the relationship issue between a Jewish person from Harvard, intellectual, marry a village woman in Eastern Germany?
Yes.
Did that help? Socialism help you in that regard?
Well, I wouldn't say that it helped particularly in my marriage. That was my job. But my wife came from a from a little village in the south of the GDR. She was basically non-political. I think her father was a carpenter who was, I think, before the Nazi period, he was a social democrat. There were no communists down in that area, in that rural area, but he was a trade union man. And my mother-in-law came from an extremely poor background, had almost no education, but she was an anti-fascist. She hated the Nazis, and he did too. And my wife, without being particularly political, she hated the Nazis. Whenever in a radio program they had a reconstruction of the war broadcast from the Nazis, she almost literally shuddered. And she remembered in school these Nazi teachers with their corporal punishment. She had it, which made it closer, even though we had almost no equal background in terms of, in fact, I was not sure that we could marry and really get along, because she'd never been to a concert. I think she'd hardly ever read a book, maybe never. And yet, in the end, first of all, not only did she come to love classical music like I did and the theater, but she became a librarian, and a very good librarian in the hospital there. So that, and I should also add, she was extremely bitter when the GDR died. She remained bitter to the end, as I did, I should say, but she emotionally even more. She saw it as I did, as a counter-revolution, but she wouldn't have put it in those words. She hated it. I'll just say one sentence which I have used, which was used in a TV, in a YouTube interview, which some of you might see, and which partly cut out. I said this in GDR days when I was walking around in the cities or towns, and I did an awful lot as I traveled all over. If I saw some new building going up, whether it was housing or a school or a theater, I felt it belongs partly to me. It's partly mine. This is all mine. Today, when I see a new building going up, I would tend rather to think, who's making money on this one? And this is an important difference, I would say.
So my political question. Do you have any opinion on why Soviet Union collapsed? Since you do not condemn Khrushchev and Khrushchev to you is okay.
There are various reasons. One reason, I think, is simply that history and geography determined that the Soviet Union was the poorer part of the world as opposed to the West, that Eastern Europe was the poorer part of Europe, that the GDR was the poorer part of Germany. and that the West, especially the United States, undamaged in the war, had a giant, giant advantage, which they didn't have. After all, the Soviet Union was destroyed not once but twice. And add to that, however, I think also I would have to say, as I indicated before, that there were good and bad traditions in the communist tradition. It's partly because the communists, ever since they began in the 19th century, have always been under terrific pressure, obviously from the people who didn't want to lose their profits. And this pressure has resulted in a certain, we would call a hedgehog mentality. You're on the defensive against all the opposition. This, to keep together, it tends to lead to suspicion of anybody who disagrees on this or that and who criticizes. And this tends to lead to a narrowness of vision. And this, I found this in the party in the United States. Not so much at Harvard, where we had a very widespread discussion, but in Buffalo, a tightness and a questioning, is he really on my side or is he beginning to deviate? And this hampered us in reaching out. And it was this kind of people who had the same goal that I did, but had this rather narrow dogmatic vision, who ruled the GDR and who ruled the Soviet Union up until the time of Gorbachev, with Khrushchev not quite so in that direction. Then, however, I think this played an important part, plus the economic disadvantage, and many blunders that were made, but also there's a question about Gorbachev himself. I had a discussion today about this, whether perhaps Gorbachev was not really devoted to saving the Soviet Union and to saving socialism. In fact, in later years, I have read quotations where he said he was against socialism. And I have read articles where he tells how wonderfully he got along with the Pope. That was the Polish Pope, who was an anti-communist. He said that, and I think that he seemed willing, perhaps to save the Soviet Union economically, to make so many compromises to Washington that it meant cutting off help to the rest of the world, to Eastern Europe, and basically to giving up basic questions. And then Washington found that that didn't go far enough. He perhaps wanted to save at least the Soviet Union politically. But then they found Yeltsin, who was ready to do any damn thing they wanted. And they let Gorbachev, let him fall, let him drop, and grabbed onto Yeltsin, who was a complete marionette. So that I think this all played a part in it. And I think we have to learn from the mistakes, but also learn from the terrific successes, what they accomplished in the Soviet Union in those few years they had between the end of the Civil War and the Nazis, those 20 years, in 200 million people or so learning to read and building up a giant industry and creating a new country. We have to credit that, while regretting the problems and mistakes which were partly determined by history and by geography.
Mr. Grossman, just to follow up on your answer, if the General Secretary and the presidents of the Soviet Union could betray socialism in 91, couldn't they have done that in 1930, some of them?
30? So, in other words, perhaps there were traitors. It's possible. It's possible. We know that for example, that the Soviet army, until Hitler came, worked with the German army. And perhaps there were, which was still a sort of, it was also considered an outsider, a pariah after the war. Perhaps there were closeness there. It's possible there was treachery. We know that there was attempts to undermine. We know that what the CIA does in every country in the world today. I'm sure they were very, very busy in the Soviet Union. It's possible they had that. At the same time, reading about Bukharin and Radek, I cannot believe that they were traitors. I can believe that they opposed Stalin on various his policies, and I think perhaps there was a question of power struggle. But I cannot believe that all those people who were executed were traitors, and I know quite a few people today still, or I've known them over the years in the GDR, including a very good friend of mine whose father was sent to the Gulag for 10 years and after that to the North, and was and remained until his death a true communist. There were too many like that who I knew, who were locked up although they were communists. So I cannot believe that these are traitors.
Okay, program is ended. Bonnie's instructed us. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, and I'll sign all books. And if you want to email